Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 184. Chapter 184. After the definite refusal he had received, Petya went to his room, and there locked himself in, and wept bitterly. When he came in to tea, silent, morose, and with tear-stained face, everybody pretended not to notice anything. Next day, the emperor arrived in Moscow, and several of the Rostovs' domestic serfs begged permission to go and have a look at him. That morning, Petya was a long time dressing and arranging his hair and collar to look like a grown-up man. He frowned before his looking-glass, gesticulated, shrugged his shoulders, and finally, without saying a word to anyone, took his cap and left the house by the back door, trying to avoid notice. Petya decided to go straight to where the emperor was and to explain frankly to some gentlemen-in-waiting, he imagined the emperor to always be surrounded by gentlemen-in-waiting, that he, Count Rostov, in spite of his youth, wished to serve his country, that youth could certainly be no hindrance to loyalty, and that he was ready to... While dressing, Petya had prepared many fine things he meant to say to the gentlemen-in-waiting. It was on the very fact of being so young that Petya counted for success in reaching the emperor. He even thought how surprised everyone would be at his youthfulness. And yet in the arrangement of his collar and hair, and by his sedate, deliberate walk, he wished to appear a grown-up man. But the farther he went, and the more his attention was diverted by the ever-increasing crowds moving towards the Kremlin, the less he remembered to walk with the sedateness and deliberation of a man. As he approached the Kremlin, he even began to avoid being crushed and resolutely stuck out his elbows in a menacing way. But within the Trinity Gateway, he was so pressed to the wall by people who were probably unaware of his presence and his patriotic intentions with which he had come, that in spite of all his determination he had to give in and stop while carriages passed in, rumbling beneath the archway. Besides Petya stood a peasant woman, a footman, 2 tradesmen, and a discharged soldier. After standing some time in the gateway, Petya tried to move forward in front of the others without waiting for all the carriages to pass, and he began resolutely working his way in with his elbows. But the woman just in front of him, who was the first against whom he directed his efforts, angrily shouted at him. "What are you shoving for, young lordling? Don't you see we're all standing still? Then why push?" "Anybody can shove," said the footman, and also began working his elbows to such an effect that he pushed Petya into a very filthy corner of the gateway. Petya wiped his perspiring face with his hands, and pulled up the damp collar, which he had arranged so well at home to seem like a man's. He felt that he no longer looked presentable, and feared that he were now to approach the gentleman-in-waiting. In that plight he would not be admitted to the emperor. But it was impossible to smarten oneself up or to move to another place, because of the crowd. One of the generals who drove past was an acquaintance of the Rostovs, and Petya thought of asking his help, but came to the conclusion that that would not be the manly thing to do. When the carriages had all passed in, the crowd, carrying Petya with it, streamed forward into the Kremlin square, which was already full of people. There were people not only in the square, but everywhere, on the slopes and on the roofs. As soon as Petya found himself in the square, he clearly heard the sound of bells and the joyous voices of the crowd that filled the whole Kremlin. For a while, the crowd was less dense, but suddenly all heads were bared, and everyone rushed forward in one direction. Petya had been pressed so that he could scarcely breathe, and everyone shouted, "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" Petya stood on tiptoe and pushed and pinched, but could see nothing except the people about him. All the faces bore the same expression of excitement and enthusiasm. A tradesman's wife standing beside Petya sobbed, and the tears ran down her cheeks. "Father, angel, dear one," she kept repeating, wiping away her tears with her fingers. "Hurrah!" was heard on all sides. For a moment, the crowd stood still, but then it made another rush forward. Quite beside himself, Petya, clenching his teeth and rolling his eyes ferociously, pushed forward, elbowing his way and shouting hurrah, as if he were prepared that instant to kill himself and everyone else. But on both sides of him, other people with similarly ferocious faces pushed forward, and everybody shouted hurrah. "So this is what the emperor is," thought Petya. "No, I can't petition him myself. That would be too bold." But in spite of this, he continued to struggle desperately forward, and from between the backs of those in front, he caught glimpses of an open space with a strip of red cloth spread out on it. But just then, the crowd swayed back. The police in front were pushing back those who pressed too close to the procession. The emperor was passing from the palace to the Cathedral of the Assumption, and Petya unexpectedly received such a blow to his side and ribs, and was squeezed so hard, that suddenly everything grew dim before his eyes, and he lost consciousness. When he came to himself, a man of clerical appearance, with a tuft of gray hair at the back of his head, and wearing a shabby blue cassock, probably a church clerk and chanter, was holding him under the arm with one hand while warding off the pressure of the crowd with the other. "You've crushed the young gentleman," said the clerk. "What are you up to? Gently, they've crushed him! They've crushed him!" The emperor entered the Cathedral of the Assumption. The crowd spread out again more evenly, and the clerk led Petya, pale and breathless, to the Tsar cannon. Several people were sorry for Petya, and suddenly a crowd turned toward him and pressed round him. Those who stood nearest him attended to him, unbuttoned his coat, seated him on the raised platform of the cannon, and reproached those others, whoever they might be, who had crushed him. One might easily get killed that way. What do they mean by it, killing people? Poor dear, he's as white as a sheet, various voices were heard saying. Petya soon came to himself, and the color returned to his face. The pain had passed, and at the cost of that temporary unpleasantness he had obtained a place by the cannon from where he hoped to see the emperor, who would be returning that way. Petya no longer thought of himself as presenting his petition. He could only see the emperor, and he would be happy. While the service was proceeding in the Cathedral of the Assumption, it was a combined service of prayer on the occasion of the emperor's arrival and of thanksgiving for the conclusion of peace with the Turks. The crowd outside spread out, and hawkers appeared, selling kvass, gingerbread, and poppy seed sweets, of which Petya was particularly fond. And ordinary conversation again could be heard. A tradesman's wife was showing a rent in her shawl and telling how much the shawl had cost. Another was saying that all silk goods now had got dear. The clerk who had rescued Petya was talking to a functionary about the priests who were officiating that day with the bishop. The clerk several times used the word plenary of the service, a word Petya did not understand. Two young citizens were joking with some serf girls about the cracking of nuts. All these conversations, especially the joking with the girls, were such as might have had a particular charm for Petya at his age, but they did not interest him now. He sat on his elevation, the pedestal of the cannon, still agitated as before by the thought of the emperor and by his love for him. The feeling of pain and fear he had experienced when he was being crushed, together with that of rapture, still further intensified his sense of the importance of the occasion. Suddenly, the sound of a firing of cannon was heard from the embankment to celebrate the signing of peace with the Turks, and the crowd rushed impetuously forward toward the embankment to watch the firing. Petya too would have to run there, but the clerk who had taken the young gentleman under his protection stopped him. The firing was still proceeding when officers, generals, and gentlemen in waiting came running out of the cathedral, and after them others in a more leisurely manner. Caps were raised again, and those who had run to look at the cannon ran back again. At least 4 men in uniforms and sashes emerged from the cathedral doors. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" shouted the crowd again. "Which is he? Which?" asked Petya in a tearful voice of those around him, but no one answered him. Everybody was too excited. And Petya, fixing on one of those 4 men, whom he could not clearly see for the tears of joy that filled his eyes, concentrated all his enthusiasm on him, though it happened not to be the emperor. Frenetically shouted, "Hurrah!" and resolved that tomorrow, come what may, he would join the army. The crowd ran after the emperor, followed him to the palace, and began to disperse. It was already late, and Petya had not eaten anything, and was drenched with perspiration. Yet he did not go home, but stood with that diminishing but still considerable crowd before the palace while the emperor dined, looking in at the palace windows, expecting he knew not what, and envying alike the notables he saw arriving at the entrance to dine with the emperor and the court footmen who served at table, glimpses of whom could be seen through the windows. While the emperor was dining, Valuev, looking out of the window, said, "The people are still hoping to see your majesty again." The dinner was nearly over, and the emperor, munching a biscuit, rose and went out onto the balcony. The people, with Petya among them, rushed towards the balcony. "Angel, dear one, hurrah, father!" cried the crowd, and Petya with it. And again the women and men of weaker mold, Petya among them, wept with joy. A large piece of the biscuit the emperor was holding in his hand broke off, fell on the balcony parapet, and then to the ground. A coachman in a jerkin who stood nearest sprang forward and snatched it up. Several people in the crowd rushed at the coachman. Seeing this, the emperor had a plateful of biscuits brought him and began throwing them down from the balcony. Petya's eyes grew bloodshot, and still more excited by the danger of being crushed, he rushed at the biscuits. He did not know why, but he had to have a biscuit from the Tsar's hand, and he felt that he must not give it away. He sprang forward, and upset an old woman who was catching at a biscuit. The old woman did not consider herself defeated, though she was lying on the ground. She grabbed at some biscuits, but her hand did not reach them. Petya pushed her hand away with his knee, seized the biscuit, and, as if fearing to be too late, again shouted, "Hurrah!" with a voice already hoarse. The emperor went in, and after that the greater part of the crowd began to disperse. "There, I said if we only waited, and so it was being joyfully said by various people. Happy as Petya was, he felt sad at having to go home, knowing that all the enjoyment of that day was over. He did not go straight home from the Kremlin, but called on his friend Obolensky, who was 15 and was also entering the regiment. On returning home, Petya announced resolutely and firmly that if he was not allowed to enter the service, he would run away. The next day, Count Ilya Rostov, though he had not quite yielded, went to inquire how he could arrange for Petya to serve where there would be the least danger. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 184. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 184. Humanity. One of world football's greatest tragedies occurred on the 15th of April 1989 during the FA Cup semi-final match between Liverpool FC and Nottingham Forest. The match was held that day in Hillsborough Stadium, a neutral venue in Sheffield, England. As was custom, because man's tribal passion is such that great violence is likely to erupt if one team's fans are in close proximity to another team's fans, the supporters of each club were segregated. Liverpool supporters herded into the Leppings Lane stand, a standing-only central pin right behind the goalkeeper. Outside the stadium, as kickoff approached, a large crowd gathered clamoring for entrance. The crowd became so large a bottleneck formed. The authorities decided that this was too dangerous a situation and ordered the exit gates to be opened to allow for quicker entrance. Everybody piled in, mostly into the central pins. Unfortunately, for those already in the central pins, this deluge of newcomers pushed them up against the security fence. The security fence, a safety precaution designed to guard against the dangers of hooligan pitch invasion, and a terrible instance of unintended consequences, was the means by which, in conjunction with the thronging humanity, the lives of 96 Liverpool FC supporters expired by human crush and suffocation. In today's chapter, Petya Rostov nearly falls victim to the same fate as the Liverpool 96. The young boy starts the day in complete secrecy. He dresses himself smartly and sneaks out the back door. He's off for the Kremlin with the idea that he'll personally petition the emperor for a position in the Russian army. On the streets of Moscow, Petya meets with crowds of his countrymen possessed by a fervor more feverish and historically more fatal than simple sports fanaticism, the frenzy of nationalism. Petya works his way into the middle of a particularly excited crowd, and in the process is nearly crushed to death and passes out. He's eventually saved, but shortly after reviving, he follows the Tsar to the palace, where, with yet another large crowd, he waits in patriotic ecstasy for his emperor to show himself again. The emperor does indeed show himself, this time to throw biscuits to the gathered crowd. Petya, risking yet another crush, dives into the frenzy to get at one of the emperor's biscuits. He pushes aside an old lady to achieve this goal. Then he goes home and informs his family that, like it or not, he'll be joining the army. There is a foul tribalism that beats in the heart of man. It manifests in many different ways. Sometimes, as it did at Hillsborough, it reveals itself in sports. Often, like with Pecha today, it declares itself in the form of nationalism. Despite the rather insalubrious history of our experience with nationalism as a species, it remains a popular sentiment to this very day. Nationalism is a concept deeply at odds with the cosmopolitanism of A Year of War and Peace. Unfortunately, however, it is also a passion deeply rooted in the human spirit. Daily meditation. Be neither of the green nor of the blue party at the games in the circus, nor a partisan either at the gladiator fights. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. All right, so that concludes my reading of chapter 184 and my reflection as well. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes. Tomorrow, we'll be reading and reflecting on chapter 185. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.